Hello everybody, my name is Peter Dorrington and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar brought to you today by FlowForma. Now, it's my great pleasure to be the moderator on today's webinar, and I'm joined by a great panel of experts, unfortunately one of whom is having problems with their camera, but they are there with us. So what I'd like to do firstly is introduce our three experts today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So I'm firstly going to go to Paul Stone. So Paul, would you mind a brief introduction about yourself, your role at FlowForma, and we'll talk about the company in just a second.
Hi, yeah, my name is Paul and I'm a product strategist at FlowForma. So we align the product to business needs in the marketplace, and especially in the construction sector.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Paul. I know you're going to tell us a little bit about the company in a moment. But next, I'd like to go to Matthew Harper of Vac2Go. So Matthew, if you wouldn't mind a brief introduction, please.
I'm Matt Harper. I work for a company called Vac2Go. We provide rental equipment to the construction industry. I've been in construction now for around 15 years. And the FlowForma product we are in the process of implementing. We've created some forms that we're in the process of rolling out to all of our 7 branches.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matt. And finally, not able to join us on camera, but we have Rick Dowell, who's the president of Pontem Innovations. So Rick, would you mind a brief introduction, please?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, my name is Rick Dowell. I'm the president and co-founder of Pontem Innovations, which is FlowForma's North American partner. And we focus on helping organizations utilize their data more effectively through process automation and dashboard analytics. And personally, prior to starting Pontem, I have a mechanical engineering background and spent almost 20 years in construction-related roles.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rick. So before we begin our discussion today, let's just get the housekeeping out of the way. So as this is a webinar, you don't need to worry about your cameras or microphones, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have any questions or any observations you would like to share with us, then please do drop them into chat. We'll be watching that all the way through the webinar today, and we'll try and get to as many of your questions at the end as we possibly can. But as I said, please feel free to share any of your insights or observations that you have. Now, we will be recording the webinar, so we'll send you details afterwards on how you can watch it on demand. But what I'd like you to do is not worry too much about taking lots of detailed notes. You'll have a chance to go over it again in the future because our experts have some great material they'd like to share with you today. So there will be a recording, but if you see me looking down, looking like I'm taking notes, it's because I am. There'll be a summary towards the end, but I have never attended one of these where I didn't learn something new. So I make a point of trying to scribble everything down because I've got a memory like a sieve. So then, our agenda for today, here are the topics we're going to cover. But in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who is going to do a presentation based on the grand total of 1 slide. And that's really just to set the scene. So what is it that FlowForma are hearing today as the challenges and opportunities? We'll then take that into our panel discussion. And I've got some ideas about topics I would like to cover. So I'll flash them up on screen very briefly when I do that. But we'll focus on the conversation. So after Paul's 1 slide, that's really it for the presentation side. And then, as I said, I'm going to open the floor up. So if there's anything we didn't talk about, or if you have any questions, there's the time to do it. And then what I'll do is tell you a little bit more about what happens next. And I promise I will finish on time, so we won't overrun the hour. So that's it from me for the moment. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Paul, who's going to do a little bit about setting the scene for us. And as I say, Paul has got 1 slide. So Paul, I'll keep this up until you tell me you want me to drop it, but over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Just to say a little bit about FlowForma, who we are, what the background is. So we're a process automation company that specializes in automating processes and capturing data and reporting and so on And we do that in a construction context. So we have many construction customers. Some of that you'll be hearing later on. The thing is, we're a little bit different because we focus on enabling people to digitize processes without being so dependent on IT resources, having to externalize and hire external IT resources. We're a very successful company. We've got offices in different parts of the world, including the US. We also have clients all around the globe, and we have over 200,000 users of our software at the moment. And we've earned quite a lot of global recognition in terms of awards, and we've got an increasing customer base in the construction industry in the US, also in the UK, and indeed in Asia Pacific and the Middle East as well. So that's a little bit of a background on FlowForma, and I'll pass it back to Peter now to carry on the conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. And one of the things that struck me even there in that first point was that not reliant on IT, who after all usually have a lot to do right now because there's an awful lot going on. And let's be honest, they don't normally know your business as well as you do. So the opportunity to develop that without having to enable them, I think, stands us all in good stead. Anyway, we're going to get into our first topic of conversation today, and it's this. It's about the imperative for becoming a data-centric organization. So let's get that slide out of the way, and we're going to start this conversation. So I've got some open questions. Say, please do ask your questions in chat. We'll try and address as many of them as we can. But Paul, let me come back to you first. So now, construction industry, obviously people tend to think it's a long-range thing, but how valuable is real-time data really for the construction organization of today?
It's extremely valuable. And I think every single construction company I talk to has this at the top of their mind, that they need more and more data. Why? Because data helps them make better decisions. Better decisions means they run things more efficiently, they deliver better results to the customer. So they're very focused on gathering that data and gathering it correctly. So in many environments, they're in a process of digital transformation, but they have only got to a certain level. They may be gathering data, but it may not be centralized, so you can't really report on it. Or they may simply not be gathering data at all. It may be residing on paper, on spreadsheets, and never actually getting out of that environment. So for sure, what we've seen around the world is that construction companies definitely want good set of accurate data so that they can better control their projects and deliver better results. But they see a challenge in that because with many companies, they don't have the underlying systems to capture and validate that data as the work progresses. I think with real-time information as well, what we've seen is that it makes a significant difference. If you can get that data gathered in the right way at the right time and sent to the right people, it makes a significant difference. We've seen real measured cost savings associated with the correct processing and gathering of that data. So I think it's something that, while I'm saying this, I know many people on the call already know this, that good data really improves your operations and makes you run more efficiently and helps you, as I say, deliver better results, which at the end of the day improves your relationship with your customers.
Great, thanks very much, Paul. And as somebody who's been doing data science for 20 years, I can absolutely sympathize. There's an old adage that 80% of data science is sorting out the data and 20% of it is moaning about sorting out the data. You can't make data-based decisions without good data. And in such a volatile world as we find ourselves in, the closer to currency of that data, the more important. So Rick, let me come to you then with this question. So if we accept that being a data-driven organization is important, what are the first steps to becoming data-centric, and what are some of the benefits of doing so?
Yeah, definitely. So in both my experience in construction and our experience at Pontem Innovations, the steps that are most important is understanding what metrics you're trying to measure and how they relate to your business strategy. That is by far the most important first step, because then it allows you to really target the data that is required to track those metrics and create the processes required to automate the collection, manipulation, the output, the reporting of this data. There's really there's only a handful of strategic metrics that really matter. And I think what happens in organizations is it's easy to get lost in all the things that could be measured and tracked and processes around doing that, instead of just focusing on, if we had these 3 or 4 items or pieces of data and they were accurate and they were consistent in terms of how we pulled them in, and the output was consistent, everybody knew how to use it and what the goals were with that data, that would go a long way. And so I'm sure Matthew will have some examples of sort of going in a stepwise fashion of doing one at a time. But I think that's really important is pick a couple key metrics and do those really well, because now you have a good experience from a change management perspective that can be built on within the organization. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rick. And there are a couple, again, of really interesting points there. As you say, the important thing is to measure what's important, not necessarily what's easy to measure. It may not be terribly meaningful, but one of the byproducts of that is that people begin to agree around the measures. And the discussion then is more about what does it mean rather than how was it derived. So once people agree that the number can be trusted, then you can actually make a decision-based process around that. So Matthew, what I'd like to do now is come to you for your practical experiences. So I'd love to know how has Vac2Go transitioned itself to becoming a data-centric organization since you deployed FlowForma?
We actually began the journey to becoming data-centric prior to FlowForma, because I'm a big believer that if you don't have people that understand the targets and the processes, then it's really hard to get them to adopt later. So we've taken a collaborative approach to our FlowForma implementation. In addition to what Paul and others have already talked about around metrics, the other thing is, in our case, with one of our use cases in using FlowForma to record truck inspections, it's less about the metrics, it's more about the accessibility and transparency of the data that has now or will now allow us an easy way for, I have 7 branches, trucks move between branches, they can now go in and see what was last done on that truck. We take a lot of pictures. We take pictures of every part of the truck before it leaves, and then we take them when it comes back. So that's not really a metric driven, but what it does allow us to do is have side-by-side pictures of before and after, so that we know what we need to charge the customer for if they've damaged the truck. That obviously leads to more revenue and more profitability. And the outcome of this data-centric culture that we're implementing is that our profits have grown 30%, our revenue has grown 40%, and we have more work than we know what to do with right now. So when you have that kind of growth going on, it's real easy for things to get hidden or not be transparent, and then you're making bad decisions. So we are really leveraging the data to help drive a lot of our daily decisions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matthew. And I think some of the things you were implying there that struck out for me are firstly about transparency of the data. So you do have this continuity where everybody can at least agree what the facts are. But I think the implication I found most interesting was the way that then when you have this data, you can begin to optimize. So optimization is often the balance between the goals. So what are your North Star metrics? What is it that you're measuring that's important to you as a business, and your constraints? So what are the things that influence your performance against those goals? And that's very hard to do without data, because all you can then do is try experimentation and see what works. Not necessarily the best way to deal with a volatile and uncertain world, where clearly where we can get data that is near real time, is agreed, is trusted, that actually allows you to develop these actionable insights then you can begin to impact business performance. And that
Exactly.
brings me really to the second point I'd like to introduce, which is this. Obviously, deploying technology to overcome the material cost rises and supply chain challenges, this is a universal thing right now. We're dealing in some really extraordinary economic climate, and that's influencing every part of our business. Our costs may be rising. We can't always pass all of those on. So we're looking at ways in which, well, can we optimize the business? Can we streamline? Are there different ways of doing things, but they receive the same or better results? So Rick, let me come to you first. And let's get rid of that slide again. What I'd really like to do is, everybody talks about digital transformation. I'm not sure everybody really knows what that means, but I think at the heart of it, it means change. So how can digitalization help drive cost savings? How do you link a digital transformation to a direct outcome like a reduction in cost?
It's a great question, Peter, because I think when people talk about digital transformation, it is somewhat ambiguous. When you're going to put effort into a change, you need to understand exactly where the cost savings and benefits are coming from. So I know we're going to talk a little bit more about supply chain in this topic, but I'm going to talk more generally to start around. I break the cost savings into three main areas. So the first one would be time savings and productivity increases. So you think about all the time that's spent on the manual repetitive work like data entry of information into multiple systems, passing around information in Excel files or emails, or just even walking around to somebody's office being like, hey, where's this process at? That can all go away or be significantly reduced with automation and better processes. So that consistency is huge, and those time savings, saving 10 minutes for 10 people every single day starts to add up very quickly. Number two is the consistency in process. It means that things don't fall through the cracks, and that cost of rework or tracking mistakes, that's really significant. You don't see it until the back end when it's like, oh, we missed this, or oh, sorry, you know what, we got 19 out of 20, but that one that we missed, it caused us to have to do rework in a bunch of areas. The third one is for me is risk reduction in our experience. So when you think about when employees leave a company or change roles, so often processes are in their head, and that transition of work can take a really long time, and same idea, things can fall through the cracks. So those would be the three main areas that I think there are a lot of cost saving opportunities. So time savings and productivity increases, consistency in your process, and the reduction in risk associated with people leaving organizations or changing roles. And then I know we'll talk a little bit further on the supply chain side of things, but I think on a process side, if you can track trends in near real time, you can be very proactive in your decision making around what has to happen in a project to be on schedule and on budget.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Rick. I'm actually going to add to that. It's actually the obverse side of the coin, if you like, in that you talked about some cost savings through things like reduction of those manual tasks and increased consistency. Actually, one of the other byproducts of that is you free up people's time to do more valuable work. So rather than doing the things that actually help create value, you're stripping out all that stuff, which is, admin. None of us would like really doing admin. And it's difficult to square that with the need to be productive whilst I'm busily filling in lots and lots of paper. Anyway, Paul, let me come back to you. So I know you deal with lots of organizations around the world. So what type and kinds of return on investment might be realized once they've deployed FlowForma, for example? So we've got this ability to enable the things, but where have you seen the upside? Where is some of that return on investment coming from?
Yeah, it's coming from a number of different areas. One is when you implement digital processes, they guide people to complete things in a certain way, in a repeatable, predictable way. And that results in ultimately taking less of their time. The other thing is, like, digital processes also make communications more efficient because communications are automated and they're also instant, so that information can be passed quickly between a person in one geographic location and another. So these kind of efficiencies have really brought about big benefits for companies. And another big effect of digital process automation is that you get a full audit trail of what's happening. So it's really easy to measure just how efficient you are, and to see immediately how many hours, for example, you've saved. And the kind of figures that we see coming back from our customer base would be a typical saving on a digital process of in the order of $80,000 per process that they implement. We have seen it run as high as $120,000, $130,000 per process, depending on obviously how many times you run that process and how big your company is and so on. But they're the kind of figures that we typically see. And the other thing is as well, is that there's a big side benefit of improvement in customer relations. But one other thing is that we have seen scenarios where our customers avoided contract penalties because they could prove that they were managing their supply chain. They were correctly requisitioning materials, for example. So we had a very large project in the UK where they avoided a $10 million penalty just by digitizing the materials requisition process. So we really see very significant returns on investment, pretty much regardless of the process. So whether it's a relatively small process or a full-blown supply chain process, you're guaranteed to see a return typically of 50% or more when you digitize that process.
Can I add something to that too? Because Paul, brings up a really good point, and that's like we're focusing on the non-value-added work first, to try to eliminate as much of that as possible through automation and integration. The other big benefit, and it's kind of hard to quantify, but we have multiple systems, and our ERP system, for instance, there is data that's important to us that the system doesn't have a place to hold. FlowForma fills that gap for us. The other gap that it fills is that it's able to go pull information from multiple systems. So we have an IoT-based GPS tracking system on all of our trucks, and we have our ERP systems and supply chain systems and all that stuff. It gives us the ability to get those two systems working together in concert, so that as a best example, when a truck comes back, we have to go and pull information from the GPS and write it on a piece of paper, and then we have to go pull information about the contract from the ERP system and put that on the piece of paper. We have to get VIN numbers off of the trucks, all those things. That's all eliminated with the new process. So we're able to pull that VIN number, fuel, all kinds of metrics out of the IoT system. We're able to pull the contract information together, mash them up together, and give the guys in the field one view of the data instead of them having to go to multiple places. And the other important point, not having to have multiple licenses that aren't going to get used to the extent that they should. So that's a big win on the license thing, and that is measurable.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. That's a really interesting point, because I think all of us know the big bang, rip out and replace approach to IT is not really anybody's cup of tea anymore because of so much risk. And yes, you're right. We all are familiar with certain sets of application sets and executive, software at the enterprise level. Being able to separate the data from the process so that you have that flexibility, so that you can change one part without having to rip the whole thing apart to do it, incredibly important in such a volatile world. So let me just come back to Rick very briefly then. I mean, it sounds great. So I think we're making a good case for digital transformation or digitalization. But Rick, realistically, how long would you say it is before you start to see some of the cost savings coming out of these approaches?
For sure. I think in our experience that you can start to see some benefits in 6 to 8 weeks. If I think a couple key components of that would be understanding that your current process, at least at 80% of it, because we find that a lot of times people are like, well, we do it this way, but it's not actually that detailed. So if you have a good understanding of what your process is, you also understand your gaps. And now if you're implementing FlowForma, you can really improve it very quickly. And that would be another key piece. Is I think you want to avoid our experiences. You want to avoid the scenario of, hey, here's 5 processes. Let's start working on all 5. No, let's do one and do it really well. And then you can have that targeted phased approach, and you can start to see the benefits in that 6 to 8 weeks. And it's amazing. You've learned so much in that first one. The second one can go faster. And all of a sudden, I know Paul has many examples of clients where, they have 25 or 40 different processes, and that 30th or 35th process goes pretty quickly. They start getting the benefits within weeks. And so our experience is that's pretty exciting for the people who've been utilizing the process.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rick.
We saw immediate benefit just because the implementation forces us to go understand the processes that are happening. And what I think happens back in the executive office is very different than what actually happens in the field. So as you start to go through that process of discovery and what's really happening, we've had multiple instances in going through those processes where we found little nuggets that we could take advantage of and kill off immediately. And in 2 cases, we decided we didn't even need the process. We just needed to issue a policy, and that was, and it's been working great ever since.
Yeah, that optimization happens just by exploring and having a better tool. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, Matthew, that's a great point, because often after a time, business processes tend to accumulate lots of tasks and gates that were put there because something bad happened once upon a time, and situations changed and nobody went back and actually stripped it out. This is a great opportunity to do some house cleaning and actually say, do we really need to do all of that? Because after all, the best processes tend to be simple and elegant, and we try and get rid of as much of that additional weight as possible. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack now for this part of the conversation, because we talked about the technology, but I'd like to talk about people. Now, unless you've been living under a rock recently, we've all been hearing about stories about hiring and firing, about a lot of volatility in the labor market. So I'd really like to just talk about this for a moment. How can digitalization help with the skills labor shortage? It's a thing. We all know that we're competing for staff. So Paul, let me come to you again first. So one of the things that obviously is in this is to build an agile and resilient organization. We need to make sure that projects are completed on time and on budget. How can digitalization help doing that during a labor shortage? So when we know people are often one of the resources in most demand.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we hear, especially in the US, everybody is short of people. Everybody is worried about how they're going to resource their projects in the current year and even next year. And one way to help with that is to implement digital processes that optimize the use of your current resources. So in other words, do more with less. So that basically you're trying to increase the efficiency of what you do now, cut out the slack, and basically get more out of your existing workforce without having to recruit additional people. So that's, I think, a key benefit of process digitization, that you are producing measurable benefits and you're cutting down the number of hours required to do the work. You're reducing the risk and increasing the certainty that you'll complete the work on time and manage your project so that you don't have overruns. And therefore, you're just making better use of the resources that you have right now. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, which we might cover a little bit more on later, is improving the onboarding of new resources into your crew so that you can basically get people up and running as quickly as possible and make them productive as quickly as possible. So I think they're the main 2 sides that we see happening in the market, the biggest usage of processes to improve the resilience of the organization.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Paul. So Rick, let me come to this because I know this is something you've been thinking about as well. So how can digitalization help a workforce work smarter and more efficiently? So how do we get more out of the same people?
Yeah, I think that's the goal for every organization. Every time you bring forward some sort of process optimization, is you want everybody to be working more efficiently. So we talked about time savings, and which means that people are more efficient. We also have more time to spend on things that can't be easily automated. And you had touched on this, Peter, that idea of things like talking with clients, brainstorming, strategy, planning, training, optimization. These are things that can't be done by machines or AI or anything. This has to be done by people, and having time to do that because you're not doing these manual repetitive tasks is really important. And I'll maybe tell a quick story about one of our clients who, on the HR onboarding side of things, they are in a business where they hire people on a lot of short-term contracts, whether it's 3 months, 6 months. And so they're constantly trying to recruit, bring people in, get them up to speed, get all the things in place, certificates, so that they can get these people to the field. And the amount of time, and this was all done in an Excel spreadsheet, so the amount of time that was spent communicating with all their different field, all the sites and the leaders on those sites, being like, hey, when's this guy going to be here? Is he going to be here next week, tomorrow? I need him as soon as possible. They spent half their time just communicating what was going on. So by creating a process and some dashboards that allowed those people to see where people were at, instead of saying, hey, this person's in process, they could say, oh, they've completed 9 out of 10 of the certificates versus 2 out of 10. So inherently, they immediately knew, okay, we're on a good track, or you know what, I better make some contingency plans because this person's a little ways away. And so that's immediately an example of everybody working smarter and being smarter in terms of their planning.
Great, thanks very much. So now, Paul, you mentioned hiring and onboarding. So I'd love to get your thoughts about this. We live with Generation App. They are bathed in bits since they're born. I'd love to hear about how you think this influences the streamlining of hiring and onboarding.
Absolutely. If you're to ask me what's the single biggest use case among a construction client base, it would be, onboarding, because basically everybody has a desperate need for it. They need to improve it, and typically they don't have a system that helps them do that. So we have clients who are managing like 200 contractors, constantly changing workforce on a very large spreadsheet. And that's just one example. It's all over the place. It happens everywhere. So by digitizing your onboarding process, you're first of all forcing people through a route. You're making sure that they have all the necessary certifications, etc. So you're reducing the need to go back and loop around the onboarding process. You can drive it through by checking it at every stage. You're providing that visibility so that people, as Rick was saying, people see the current status of onboarding. And you can also introduce labor requisition processes where people who are starting projects can actually specify, this is the set of people that I need, and put that through a process to make sure those people are there on time at the start of the project. So there's many use cases in the scope of onboarding, and every one of them drive efficiency in terms of getting the right resources at the right place at the right time.
Great, having people who are ready, willing, and able. That's what I think we're about. Now, Matthew, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to bring to you a question that's come in from the floor. So I'll start with the first point, which was actually, could you tell us a little bit about some of the improvements you've seen at Vac2Go? But also, the question was this: what comes first, people or process? So where did you start?
I always start with people. Generally, the people know whenever you're going to redefine or define a new process. It's been my experience, and I guess I should back up. I was in IT for the better part of 20 years. Everything from a technician fixing a computer or a printer, and worked my way up to CIO. So I've done programming and database stuff and all that. And I guess my biggest claim to fame is being able to position the right IT solution to solve a business problem. And we all go through these app selection processes, and you really don't know what you're getting until you sit down and get in front of it. And I give kudos to FlowForma, because there were no surprises on my end. I knew exactly what I was getting. I knew exactly what the capability was. And I love the fact that it's like programming without programming. You create stuff without having to get a developer. So the big thing for me is the reason I deal with employees first, and Vac2Go is probably the best example. I joined the company about 2 years ago, and there was no data-centric organization here. There was very little transparency. And when employees, even in Lean, the concept in Lean is employees have to know what good looks like. You've got to be able to demonstrate to them, this is what good looks like. And if you can build a process and include forms and things like that that help them meet that process, then you'll get good quality data. And we are a collaborative environment. That's another cultural change for us, is that we don't have 7 individual silos working, to meet their own targets. We are more than the sum of our parts. Everyone is working towards the same goals. And what we have started to see is a lot more collaboration even between branches and them helping each other out. So that's very important for us, because we are a 24/7, 365. Anytime somebody wants a truck, we're there. And we're not the cheapest rental company in the business. We're the highest. But there's a reason why we can command those kind of prices, and that's because of our responsiveness and our customer service. In regards to the safety question, I think Rick hit on it. The speed of communication happens faster. And when you're on a construction site, that's very important when it comes to safety. I was on a construction site with 6,000 workers, over 40 different construction companies on this one site, all working at the same time. And I went for an executive review, and I got surprised because they called all the execs from all the companies into a room and made us watch a video of all the things we were doing wrong on the site, the dangerous things. I don't like those kind of meetings. Nobody likes those kinds of meetings. But that was an area that needed process improvement, and what ended up happening was all the vendors were able to gain access to the same system that showed recordable safety incidents or even safety suggestions across all 40 companies. So if there was a safety incident, if somebody cut their finger opening a box, that came out and that got communicated to all the companies so that they could avoid that risk going forward. So that's the importance of process around safety and some of the benefits I think people will see out of having a system like this.
Great, thanks, Matthew. We'll come back to that in just a second. But before we do, I think there's one other thing that appeals to me about that, and that is that I mentioned Generation App. People are used to being in a digital environment now. It's part of their expectation of an organization, that the reason that they will be able to excel in their job is because all of this non-value adding work is getting done through systems rather than them spending time. So they can do the things that we talked about, focus on moving the business forward, strategy, consultation. And when everybody shares the same North Star, you're able to pivot easier, because you know where you're going, so you can still change course. Anywho, what I'd like to do is just introduce the next topic about health and safety. So Rick, let me come to you. So we've already heard there from Matthew a little bit about how they've introduced some changes as a result of that, but how does digitalization help with health and safety risk management? Or put it in a broader context, risk management.
Yeah, I think from a safety perspective, health and safety, it is so much about data and long-term trends and tracking things so that you are reducing your risk. And the ability to reduce risk on a site is done through a bunch of little things. It's not these big things. Those things have been taken care of. It's all the smaller things that you see, because if you look at the safety pyramid and what happens with near misses and actual more serious incidents, there are all these little warning signs along the way. So if you can track those, you can do a bunch of things to stop a major incident from happening, is the theory behind it. And that means you need data. So in order to do that, it's really important to have consistency. You need auditability of the data and tracking, making it useful, having a variety of ways to show the data so that you can have proactive safety messages that are relevant. And I think all of that comes down to not recycling the same information, but also having real-time information around what's happening now. Not, oh, hey, what happened 4 months ago? Well, that's irrelevant, because the construction site is different. There's different people on it. There's a different phase of construction. So I think the digitalization of that health and safety risk management really ties into having the ability to track all this data from all these different sources, and also them being able to communicate it broadly to people that they just want to know, like, what does it mean for me? And you can quickly get that information out. So that's really valuable to sites, and Matthew gave a great example, I think, of how that can be put into action.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rick. And I think there's a point there that I liked. It's the way you capture the institutional knowledge, but not in the heads of the people, so that you can rapidly share that with everybody else. So best practice comes out. Now, one of the other things is, Matthew, I've heard you in the past talk about connected construction. So what I'd like to know is, what role does connected construction play in helping construction sites stay safe? So we have this ability to not only collaborate, but to connect.
There's so many ways that this can be used that I don't even think they've all been thought of yet. We have, our trucks are vacuum trucks. They can be dangerous if they're not used properly, or if they run into some sort of interference. There can be incidents happen in those cases. And when you're on a site, especially a large site, sometimes an incident will happen that's not even near you, but you need to know about it. So as an example, we have a dashboard that we have now provided to our customers that allow them to see where all our trucks are on their site. So if they have an incident or an emergency or an evacuation or anything like that, they know where our trucks are, and they understand what those trucks are doing, and they can mitigate any kind of risk that truck might pose to the incident that's happening at the time. They can also live communicate with the drivers of those trucks through that dashboard, and they can get access to all of our companies or all of our customers' safety information, if that's something that customer is providing to them, and be able to better analyze job hazards and take action on those job hazards, and then make that repeatable downstream. It's one thing to fix a problem. It's another thing to eliminate it, and that really helps to eliminate those kinds of problems from happening.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. So before we move on, I'm going to ask one final question very briefly of Paul and Rick. Matthew, you mentioned things like GPS trackers and so on. So let's start with you, Paul. What other new technologies are being used to help improve health and safety in construction that you're aware of?
Yeah, so health and safety in terms of processes, I mentioned onboarding was probably the most popular. Health and safety will be number 2. And what we find that people are using FlowForma on mobile devices to actually capture health and safety incidents as they happen. So they're also doing things in non-conformity reporting, where they're literally taking a snap with the mobile device and they're taking the snap saying, here's the problem. And then it goes on to certain remediation activities after that. So we see that the fact that everybody seems to have a mobile device, and basically they're able to use those mobile devices at the point where the health and safety issue is identified. So it's with on-site and real time. This is where the problem is, and it's interesting that that point about little things make a difference. So all of these health and safety issues most of them will be small things. But what you're doing over time is you're gathering that in a central database. So in terms of what technologies are impacting health and safety, is that ability to store all that information centrally and spot trends. So some of our larger clients are actually doing that. They're actually spotting trends. Oh, well, this is likely scenarios where issues may happen. Therefore, we're going to avoid that by putting in a training program, for example, that trains people. Okay, well, this is an issue. Watch out for this, because this might happen on your particular project. So that's so sorry to sum up there. It's mobile devices and that central data capture that you can actually build up a database to track trends.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We never leave home without it. In fact, I think it's more stressful to leave home without your mobile than without your wallet or purse. Rick, I'll just briefly ask you the same thing. What are some of the technologies that you're aware of that are beginning to enter this sphere?
Yeah, I think similar to what Paul said, it's just that idea of being able to do some large scale tracking. You know, you hear about sites where they're able to have a camera and using AI, they're able to pick up different trends and things. So it's done automatically. It doesn't require somebody's interpretation of what happened or them writing it down. Is they can just get trends from the cameras. Alternatively, also with near miss reporting, you can start to do sentiment analysis around some of the language that comes in, especially when you have a wide variety of reports coming in from different sites. You can start to do some sentiment analysis and get a sense of, hey, what's actually happening, and more importantly, what's changed. I think that's the biggest piece, is what's changed from, let's say, a month ago or 2 weeks ago. And if you're starting to see changes and you don't like those changes, well, now you can maybe do something proactively before it's too late.
Great, thanks very much, Rick. So our final topic, and I'm going to squeeze this one in, is this. It all sounds wonderful, but yeah, let's get hard-nosed about it. What are the kinds of measurable business outcomes of automating manual construction processes? So Paul, I'm going to come first to you for a brief word on this, if you wouldn't mind, about what are some of the most common business outcomes that you see in construction when you automate these manual processes?
So I'll keep it as brief as possible and say that reduced timeframes are the most obvious benefit that you're going to get. And they're very easily measurable when you use digital processes, because the system basically records those timeframes for you. You just have to look at them to see the improvements that are being made. And other than that, I would also say better resource usage. And it's partly through the communications, which has come up a few times over the course of the webinar, that improved communications actually makes your resources work better together, so that they can achieve their results more quickly and more predictably. I might leave it there, Peter, because I realize we're short in time.
No, it's fine. No, it's a great answer, and I think that better utilization of resources and this collaborative approach, the collegiate approach. After all, in a world where everything's changing, who knows where the insight's going to come from that allows you to find your path through that. So the ability to collaborate using the devices you already have, absolutely. Rick, I know this is a question that you thought about. We've talked about, well, how long do you typically see ROI? You talked about, well, you might see the first one within 6 to 8 weeks, I think you said. But from a business point of view, is it something, is it a process where you say stop after a year, we're all done? Or is there something that is this continual accrual of benefit?
Yeah, and our experience has definitely been there's a continual accrual of benefit, right? Because once the process is in place and there's consistency with it, there's always iterations and additional improvements. Business is always evolving, and frankly, one of the things we like to talk about is if things are changing, it's because it's changing for the better, right? So that's always going to be some improvements. But just to give you an idea around that, the time frame, Paul mentioned that there's about 80,000, could be over $100,000 worth of benefit per significant business process. And FlowForma has also measured that the deployment of processes is about 60% faster. So you can do the math there on how much more quickly you realize the benefit. If you can deploy that process 60% faster and save yourself $100,000 in the process, that starts to hit your bottom line much more quickly.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And then let me just come to Matthew for a final word on this one as well. So you mentioned you started off with people and you looked at processes, and I'd love to get your thoughts about what do you think some of the types of processes you would most commonly expect to see being automated within the construction sector?
Well, there are a lot, and we don't have enough time, but in general, I would say that my experience in construction is, especially large construction like that 6,000 person site I was talking about before, when something happens in the field, the typical construction process is that goes from the guy in the field to the supervisor to maybe the project manager, maybe to the GM, and then maybe it goes to the vendor that you're renting equipment from, and you get the equipment fixed or replaced. Where I see this all really, the big driver of all of this is shortening that communication time frame and going from field to vendor. That's the value add. If you can cut out all that middle stuff and you can go field to vendor or field to customer or back office to field, that is the areas where we're going to see the most benefit. Everyone has emails, as you've mentioned. We're an app-centric kind of society nowadays. But between emails, text messages, voicemails, there's a lot for a lot of people to have to mine through in order to get to the things that that really move the needle. And so probably one of the other biggest advantages in construction is we collect a lot of data in construction that we don't do anything with. And so you're collecting data that isn't going to move the needle, but it's some requirement because somebody at some time said it was. Well, if it's not moving the needle, and it's not data that you're going to use to improve or change the business, stop collecting.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, it's like compliance. None of us like doing it all, but we all do require to do it. It doesn't actually add value to us. You could argue the case that it adds value elsewhere. But in times where we're in these uncertain economic times, we have to focus on what's creating value if we're to actually, well, in your case,
a whole lot around regulation and things like that the processes can help make sure that you stay out of trouble. They can alert you and automate the notification of things. So with all the capabilities nowadays, with most applications, even the regulatory applications now being online, if you can connect to their online site, fill out a form on your side, and it takes care of solving that regulatory issue, great. That's just real easy.
Great, thanks very much. So I've got an eye on the time. So I think just to recap a couple of points from me that I picked up is that, I think that clearly there is a compelling case to actually automate what you can. It not only because it has benefit in its own case for driving down costs, but it creates new opportunity and gets rid of all that non-value adding work. And it can help you manage a complex world so you can make data-based decisions. After all, we would all love to be in a position where we're working with timely, accurate data that we all agree and trust. It can help address the labor shortage, not only by reducing non-value adding work, which none of us likes, but it makes it easier for those of us that are tech savvy and expect to be in a tech enabled environment to get on with our jobs and get the rest of the stuff out of the way. And that includes in the environment of health and safety and risk management, so that we learn as institutions and we can spread that learning very quickly. And I think, as Matthew, you pointed out a really great point, once we've learned that something is a repeating problem, we eliminate it. We don't have to just say, well, this is what the cure looks like. And we don't have to wait for people to organically share that. There are measurable business outcomes. We've heard from Rick and Paul, and even Matthew, about the commercial case, that there are real dollars to be earned back from this approach, and you don't have to wait for years to see it. You can actually start to get benefit almost immediately, not least from doing that. Now, I've got time for one or two questions, and I've had a couple coming in, but let's start. Matthew, I'm going to come to you for the first one, and then I'm going to go to Paul for the same thing. Where'd you start? Are there some processes which are better starting points than others? And where did you start?
Well, that's a really good question, and it takes looking at each process and determining where the most bang for your buck is, and that's where we try to start. And I will say that I'm not 100% person. If I get a process to 80% and it solves my problem, that extra 20%, the juice may not be worth the squeeze. And so we'll get it to 80% and move on. But there's a lot of factors that come into place. We look at how much time it's probably going to take to formulate the process, adaptability, training, all the things that are going to go when you develop these processes. So we want to spend our time on the biggest ones first and then start working our way down.
Yeah, perfect. It's a great point, because actually when the world is volatile, getting a perfect product process for a world that may not exist in 3 weeks' time probably doesn't help. But the fundamentals remain the fundamentals. So make sure you get the big things. Paul, let me come to you, and then I'm going to come to Rick for exactly the same question. Yeah, where do you see people that work with FlowForma starting? What are some of the common process points they start with?
Yeah, so our general guidance we give to our customers is go for Captain Obvious, go for the obvious problem that everybody understands. So everybody understands the problem with the process itself as well understood, get that digitized and use that as a starting block to get you going, to gain momentum for further change in the business. So all of our customers never just do one process, they do many. So I'll give you an example. We signed up a new customer last week. They want to digitize 120 processes. They gave us a list of 120. So it's that's kind of scale of things. But you have to start with one. So go for the Captain Obvious. Go for the one that everybody understands. That it's going to fix a pain point, a problem for everybody in the business, right? And then use that to gain momentum. Now, the other thing I'd say, and Matthew may disagree with this one, is that to start off with, to get the quickest return on investment, focus on the process first, and then do the integration piece later, right? So in other words, get your process right, get people using the process, get people backing the idea, and then look at the integration pieces. Because for sure, for all the reasons Matthew was talking about, having that common visibility across multiple applications and so on, integrating that into the process, that's a lot of benefit, but that does take a little longer. So look at the process first.
I agree with you 100%, Paul. The only thing I would add, maybe is a better answer to the question than I gave originally, was where I started was I was looking at what processes do we do every day, multiple times a day that need it.
Good one. Yeah.
Great. I'll put away the pistols at dawn then. So I think it's a collaboration there. So Rick, I'm going to come briefly, if you wouldn't mind, same thing, where's a good starting point for this? And then Matthew, I've got a question for you. I'm going to try and squeeze it in. So Rick, your point.
Sure. I'll go quick on this one. Is I think I agree with Paul. There's two main areas. One is the problem that touches a ton of different departments and areas because it's a cross-functional, cross-department issue. That's a great starting point because who owns that? How do we get this streamlined? And then the next place that I would start is there's an individual or group where they have a very specific process that they know is a huge pain point and they're very motivated to be like, we know there's a better way. Let's go there. So either really broad across multiple functions or really narrow and a person who's like, I know this can be solved and I'm going to be right there beside you creating this process.
Perfect. Thank you. Sounds like a good case for partnership. Now, Matthew, this is the question. I'm going to read it out verbatim. So Matthew, you are a rare leader, but not all leaders see the benefit of a new solution. How do you get buy-in from leaders to see the value? So how do you persuade the rest of your executive committee about the value of this? That's probably a whole webinar in itself.
Well, today I'm the chief operating officer, so I make the call. I don't have to convince anybody really, and it's a nice place to be. But prior to this role, to get buy-in from executive leadership, a lot of times it comes down to ROI, and sometimes ROI is hard to quantify. I have done many improvement engagements where the ROI wasn't clearly identifiable, but you've got to find a way to have it make sense to the executive team. So in the case of our inspection form here, nothing's broken, the paper works. But what we figured out is by revamping the process and using FlowForma, we'll save 15 minutes per person per day. That's 48 people, or a half hour per person per day across 48 people. That's 24 hours. That's the equivalent of 3 full-time headcounts. So the way I look at it is, does it reduce cost? Does it avoid cost? Does it improve productivity? Or does it generate revenue? That's really what it comes down to. And if you can develop a process that meets one or all of those or multiple, it's hard for an executive to say no to that. And that's really what you have to do, is build a case to not let them say no. And I've had really good experience in the past going to executives with 3 options and saying, and I choose option 1, and here's why I'm choosing option 1. And a lot of times when you present that to an executive that way, it's hard for them to not go with your recommendation if it makes sense. You know, you can't just go out and spend $1 million on something that's going to generate $10 of revenue. But if you give them 3 options, it at least lets them know that you've thought about other solutions and you've taken those into account. And so you're making a decision that is the best for the company.
Great, thank you very much. Sadly, we're out of time. So firstly, what I'd like to do is just let you know that we will be contacting you all after this conference, but there are some, so look out for that email. There'll be links to some assets you can download. They're on the screen right now. So there's a lot of things that FlowForma can do to help you in Quick Start. But all that really remains for me to do at this point is firstly to thank our experts. So Paul, Matt, and Rick, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the team at FlowForma for organizing today's webinar. But most of all, thank you for your attention. And until the next time, take care now and goodbye. Cheerio, everybody.
Thank you.